We may have just watched the greatest Mexico City Grand Prix of all time, and we're here to talk about it. Guys, it's the 2025 Mexico City Grand Prix review. Guys, I know a lot of us going into the Mexico City Grand Prix, we're definitely not necessarily looking forward to it the most. You know, it's not the highest excitement level in recent years as F1 heads to the heights of Mexico City, but it always has a very exciting, qualifying. It presents a lot of interesting mechanical challenges with the elevation and the air management and all of this, that, and the other thing. There's the long run down to turn one, but recently in years past, it's kind of been turn one, and then things kind of settle down, and everyone finishes like 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 seconds off of each other, and it's a bit of a procession for the next 70 odd laps. But this year, oh boy, this year cooked in ways that I don't think any of us were expecting in our wildest dreams. We're going to talk about everything that we saw over the course of the weekend. We're going to talk about our weekend quick hits, our weekend winners and losers, and we'll go over the predictions that we made before the weekend began, and then we'll take a look ahead at what is next on the F1 calendar. Let's go ahead, without further ado, jump on into this thing with our weekend quick hits. Let's get our quick hits started where we always do, right at the front when it was all said and done, and Lando Norris putting in probably one of his best weekends in Formula One, dominating basically from the jump, took pole position, led into turn one for the first time in, I think, 4 years. I think it's been since the last time a pole sitter led into turn one. It was a bit hairy there for a minute. It was 4 wide into turn one, but nevertheless, Lando Norris led basically from there the entire rest of the way, led every lap, and finished, I believe, 33 seconds ahead of P2. So it was quite a weekend from Lando Norris, who ends up taking the win, as well as taking the lead in the World Drivers' Championship, now leading teammate Oscar Piastri by a single point as we leave Mexico. And it's going to be a very interesting finish to this season to see how this championship plays out, because if Lando keeps this form, it definitely looks like it's his to lose, but at the same time, there are still 4 Grand Prix and 2 sprints left, so anything could happen. I am seated for it, that is for sure. Speaking of McLaren, let's touch on teammate Oscar Piastri, kind of coming into this weekend with a bit of no momentum when it comes to both qualifying pace and race pace to a certain degree. Comes into this weekend not really getting off on the right foot, starting P7 on the grid, not good at all. Ultimately ends up recovering to finish in P5, almost, keeping the championship lead, almost, if he hadn't been able to finish P4, but nonetheless, now falls behind by a single point. Oscar turned around a qualifying where he was, 6/10 slower than teammate Lando Norris, and it was a very interesting situation to watch because it really didn't seem like there were many reasons why Oscar would be so far behind Lando in qualifying. Ultimately, it is what it is. You can only do what you can do. He did have a nice recovery finishing P5, but at the same time, it was the first time that we saw him have some decent race pace in a couple of races. He came back through the field, got on an aggressive strategy, and was able to move up, ultimately, finishing in P5. But at the same time, he definitely needs to get his qualifying sorted out, because I think that's really where the time that the points are being lost at this point. Lando, for all of his, as well as he's doing, starting at the front and definitely having that McLaren under him is giving him a big advantage. And Oscar, starting back in the pack, deep within the Ferraris, the Mercedes, the Max Verstappen, it's definitely putting him on the back foot when it comes to making his way back through on race day. So if he gets that figured out, we'll have a very exciting championship down the stretch, but it'll be interesting to see. Brazil is going to present some interesting challenges, and we'll be interested to see how Oscar responds from there. All right, I cannot go any longer. We look like a bunch of legends. I have to mention my GOAT, Oliver Bearman, finishing P4, tying Haas's best ever Grand Prix finish, tying Romain Grosjean's P4 back in 2018. That's right, a rookie tying Haas's best ever results in a Grand Prix in P4. This was Oliver Bearman's best performance in F1 we've ever seen. I think that goes without saying. He took advantage of a lot of the chaos that really took place in the opening sequence of the race, qualifying in the top 10, ultimately starting P9 thanks to a Carlos Sainz 5-place grid penalty, and took advantage of a lot of the drama and chaos ahead at the front to ultimately send a move on Max Verstappen and make it stick in a Haas was amazing to see. We saw a lot of drivers, cutting corners and having to slow down and let people through. Ultimately, Ollie solved the C part for him. He went down the inside of Max Verstappen, parked it on the apex through the S's, and then actually showed a lot of amazing pace to hold off not only Max Verstappen in the immediacy, but both George Russell and Kimi Antonelli in superior, cars. I mean, I don't think it's far-fetched to say that the Mercedes is a better car than the Haas. And so it was an incredible performance from Ollie Behrman. Obviously, he ended up actually running in the podium positions for a long while, thanks to a 10-second penalty for Lewis Hamilton, where he got that for cutting the track at turn 4 and getting a 10-second penalty. So he was actually looking on for a podium if it had not been for Max Verstappen down the stretch. This was a very interesting race tire strategy-wise, and so sort of parlayed Ollie Behrman into this one where it really seemed like the soft tire was the only tire people wanted to be on. Even the mediums were not performing quite the expectation. And so this was an interesting situation where you had teams doing 2 stops to try and get back onto the soft tire at the end. Max Verstappen had the benefit of starting on the worst tire on the medium, but finishing on the better tire on the softs. And he was making inroads left and right down the stretch of this one. And it was very hit or miss whether or not Ollie would have been able to hold him off. Ultimately, those around Ollie, both Mercedes, Oscar Piastri ended up pitting in this one again. And so ultimately Haas, I think, made the correct decision to pit again, cover off those who were pitting and secure the P4 instead of really running the risk of, sure, you might finish P3, but chances are you're not going to hold off Max Verstappen again. And then you're also under threat from those who then also pit again in George Russell, Kimi Antonelli, Oscar Piastri, and probably potentially maybe even finishing as low as like P6 or P7. And so it was a situation where in the moment I was distraught because I wanted him to really hold out and try and do his best. But at the end of the day, I think it was the right decision. Securing a P4 feels great, but the podium was right there. It was right there. I mentioned the Lewis Hamilton penalty, but we'll talk about Ferrari here briefly. Obviously, qualifying P2 and 3 in this one, it was a fantastic sign, and they actually looked like they had some really decent race pace in this one, and were potentially on for a double podium before Lewis Hamilton ended up cutting the track and gaining an advantage in his fight with Max Verstappen there on the opening sequence of the race. Ultimately, he failed to follow the race director's instructions of taking the little access road they added in the weird, awkward, triple right-hander section. He ended up cutting that corner about as tight as you possibly could have, and then did not relinquish the time gain that he got there. So that earned him a 10-second time penalty that he served at his first pit stop, and ultimately ended up finishing, P8 in the race. Charles Leclerc, on the other hand, had a bit of a moment himself on the opening lap where he kind of cut across the grass and seemingly also gained an advantage and a position, but was not noted at all by anyone. So ultimately, he came home to finish P2 on the podium once again. Was never really challenging for a win in this one, like we thought maybe he would give it a go, but the McLaren had too much pace. But regardless, Charles Leclerc, very, very solid. And honestly, if you look at it, Hamilton penalty aside, which looking at it, you go, yeah, it's definitely a penalty. There was a lot of other weird penalty decisions in this race, but unfortunately it is what it is. Regardless, I think Ferrari can take a lot of good away from this race. They're still performing pretty decently. The Hamilton penalty aside, I think it was a very strong weekend for Ferrari. Another driver I mentioned briefly, Max Verstappen. A challenging qualifying day for Verstappen and an interesting opening few laps as well. Ultimately saw him qualifying, P5 or something like that? P4, P5. Ultimately got a great run down the opening stretch, tried to make it 4 wide, but unfortunately 4 very rarely goes into 1, and so he ended up bailing across the grass and then having a bit of a tangle with Lewis Hamilton later. Ultimately, he ended up recovering to finish on the podium again, and had it not been for a VSC that came out very late, likely would have finished P2 in this race. So that Red Bull definitely showing a lot of good pace on the softs. I think starting on the mediums kind of put him on the back foot, but all things considered, I think it's about his best case scenario for Verstappen as you could get if you take the VSC, aside, because I think he was finishing P2 pretty comfortably. if that VSC doesn't come out. So very solid recovery for Max Verstappen as he once again closes up on the championship just a little bit. It's still right there. I believe he's 36 points behind Lando Norris now, and so you never know what's going to happen. Like I said, 4 Grand Prix, 2 sprints, a lot of points still on the board. Speaking of a VSC, I think we saw probably the worst VSC decision any of us have ever seen. If you didn't see what happened, Carlos Sainz in the stadium section ended up losing the rear and ended up, definitely probably had some suspension damage or even a puncture or something, because if you watch the onboard footage, he sort of loses the rear, it kind of hits the wall, and he eventually crabs his way back behind the entryway into the track for the stewards, where they would have retrieved his car anyway. But the problem isn't that. The problem is that he parked it basically exactly where the stewards would have pushed him if he had stopped where he crashed. But then with 1.5 laps to go, with multiple battles going on between Max Verstappen and Charles Leclerc for P2, and Oscar Piastri and Ollie Behrman battling for P4, a battle which if Piastri had actually been able to pass Behrman, let's be honest, he probably would have, that would have had him retaining the Drivers' Championship lead. But ultimately, a VSC gets thrown, neutralizing the race until there's a half a lap left, if that, in which point it's basically over. And it neutralizes both of these incredible battles that have been going on the entire race. It's all culminating in these moments, and it's neutralized, effectively killing it on the spot. In a situation where there was no car on track, we didn't really see if there was debris or anything on or near the racing line, and the car was parked off in the service road anyway. I will not understand it. I've not seen a concrete example of what made it a good decision. I guess it is what it is at this point, but I just wanted to mention that it might have been the worst VSC I've ever seen. And as we move on now, I can only say as my last point, I cannot wait for Brazil. Brazil is one of, if not the best race weekend on the calendar. I say that a lot. This one I think might actually be correct. Brazil is a perfect F1 circuit. Throw in a sprint race on there as well, and it is near perfection. It is probably the only weekend where I'll be happy it's a sprint race weekend, because Interlagos is amazing. It provides everything you could ever need, potentially, bad weather, very tricky conditions, very technically challenging circuit, and a couple of drivers who are savants, a couple who have struggled, and teams all of the way in between. It's going to be amazing. I cannot wait. I think we're going to see a lot of questions answered. We're going to see a lot of who has the most momentum. Can Piastri bounce back? Is Verstappen going to dominate like he does at Brazil all so often? Or is Lando Norris and that McLaren going to continue dominating? Time will tell. It'll be very, very interesting. Qualifying and, the sprints and in qualifying for the Grand Prix are going to be some of the most important sessions potentially on the rest of the calendar, specifically probably for Max Verstappen and Oscar Piastri. Because after that, you go to your Qatars, your Abu Dhabis, the McLaren is going to be very, very good at that. These are going to be the opportunities for both Max and Oscar to really put it on to Lando, or for also on the other side for Lando to really grab a hold of the championship for himself. So I cannot wait. All right, let's move on now. Weekend winners and losers. I am going with my weekend winner. Could it be anyone else? My GOAT, Ollie Behrman, running a Haas on the podium positions, holding off not only Max Verstappen, not only Kimi Antonelli, not only George Russell, but ultimately finishing ahead of Oscar Piastri in a constructor's car that is double the points ahead of P2 in the constructors. My GOAT absolutely killed it this weekend. He was opportunistic, he was fast. He was rapid in this one. I mean, I don't know how long I was stressed out of my mind with George Russell and Kimi Antonelli, somewhere between 1 and 1.5 seconds behind. And my dude absolutely killed it. It was probably the greatest race performance we've seen from him, and a P4 matching Haas's best performance in a Grand Prix. It was so close to a podium if Max Verstappen didn't happen to be on the perfect strategy for him. I was losing my mind the entire way, and as soon as he crossed the line, I was in. I could not be happier for him. It really feels like he's been on the brink of a performance like this all season long, and I'm so happy it finally got here. So, Ollie, congratulations, my weekend winner. All right, let's move it on along to our weekend loser. And this one actually could have gone a few ways. I think Alpine deserve a big shout here because boy, oh boy, are they, 2021 Haasing it up a storm right now. It's very clear they have negative interest in this 2025 car, and they have no interest in basically anything at all. They were running at the back effectively the entire time. It was impressive at how behind they really were. Another good shout out is Fernando Alonso, who had probably the funniest situation I've seen, because I haven't seen anything to the contrary, but it looks like he was asked to invert positions with Lance Stroll, into which he immediately went into the pits, parked it, turned off the car, and then left. And so that is another big one. I kind of hope that's exactly what happened, because boy, that's amazing. I mean, Aston Martin are either there or they're not, and this weekend they really were not, and so I can't really blame Fernando. But ultimately, I think my weekend loser is going to go to Lewis Hamilton. This was primed to be his first podium with Ferrari. It would have been interesting to see his strategy versus Max Verstappen's down the stretch, because Max was looking very rapid there at the end. But I think this was lining up perfectly for a first podium for Lewis. Ultimately, him cutting that, cutting the little access road and not giving back the advantage he gained by doing so, ultimately is what cost him here. And without too many other major things happening in this race, I do think that puts him squarely in, weekend loser territory. Not necessarily in big way, but just in a what could have been way. I think if Oscar Piastri had sort of, finished where he qualified or thereabouts and not shown the pace he had, he would have been a very good shout here, because Oscar actually had a really terrible start and ended up running basically from 9th and trying to battle his way back. But ultimately, I think Lewis, still looking for that maiden podium with Ferrari, was primed to do so. They looked pretty good in this one. Ultimately, a penalty basically cost him at that point. And so, as much as it pains me to say, Lewis, I'm sorry, you are my weekend loser. All right, let's move on quickly to go over our predictions results. We'll go through this quickly because there's really not a whole lot to really say on most of these. For my pick for biggest positive surprise, I went with Isaac Hadjar. It feels like we've been missing an Isaac Hadjar good weekend for a while. And while he had good moments this weekend, ultimately he just did not have what it took to finish in the points. So no points for him and no points for me for that one. As we move on to my pick for biggest disappointment, I went with Oscar Piastri. Once again, not very often you can put your championship leader in your biggest disappointment category, and I'm giving myself the point here. I mean, he looked absolutely nowhere compared to Lando. I mean, it was a weekend where you had to imagine something was wrong with the car. Obviously, in qualifying, he was reporting a lot of issues or potential issues. We don't have any confirmation one way or another, but qualifying 6/10 behind your teammate who put it on pole and finishing 40 odd seconds behind him on track. That's a tough one. He loses the championship lead. Granted, it's only by a point, but right now it looks like he is absolutely nowhere and has to get some stuff figured out. So giving myself a point there. As we move on to my qualifying predictions, I predicted a Max Verstappen pole position, a Charles Leclerc P2, and a Lando Norris P3. And so 1.5 points for me rounded up there. I actually nailed Charles Leclerc, finishing P2. Lando Norris obviously ended up taking pole, so half point on that one. And so 1.5 points in qualifying. I'll take that every day of the week. As we move on to my podium predictions, I predicted a Max Verstappen win, a Lando Norris P2, and a George Russell P3. So if I had just believed in Charles just a little bit, I could have eked out another half point here, but I will take, a single point for me on that one, as Max Verstappen half point and Lando Norris half a point. Adds up to one. I can be greedy and ask for another half point, but at the same time, I'll take a full point over nothing at all. So, and then last but not least, my one crazy prediction, and this was one I thought I cooked on all the way until the very end. My one crazy prediction is that we would see 3 mechanical DNFs in this race. There were 4 total DNFs. You had Liam Lawson, who ended up retiring early on in the race due to hit contact at the beginning of the race. So not technically mechanical DNF. We had Fernando Alonso. We're going to call a mechanical DNF because he just parked it up on his own and left the race. We had, who else was it? It was, Carlos Sainz at the end is what, ultimately, the big moment came later on when Carlos Sainz, with 69 out of 71 laps completed, pulls off to the side in the stadium section behind a barrier. And without seeing the footage, I thought I cooked here because in the Discord, I was talking with people going, does Liam Lawson count as a mechanical DNF? I'm not sure. If it was from the contact, I haven't seen why. Then does that count? And like clockwork, Carlos Sainz pulls off to the side in the stadium section, and I think I am in. I'm celebrating in the Discord. But then ultimately, after the race was over, I finally saw the clip of what happened and Carlos losing the rear and then crabbing his way back behind. Absolutely devastated me. I went from having a point to not having a point in not but a moment in time. And so no point for me on my one crazy prediction, but ultimately a very solid week as I pull up the current standings. 3.5 points for me on the weekend. Definitely not too shabby. And if we take a look at our championship standings heading into their final 4 rounds, we have me still leading the championship with 71.5 points. We have British TTG behind in second with 68 points. Sentinel 40 hot on his trails with 67.5 points. And F1 Inferno, who has been making an absolute charge down the stretch of this season, now on 65 points, and Andrew and Spectral once again not getting theirs in. So Andrew on 32.5 and Spectral still with 10.5. So it is hotting up in the championship. I mean, I hold the lead, but it's only by 3.5 points. It's only going to take a couple of bad weekends for me to really relinquish my lead. And then the fight for P2 is on. We have 3 people within, 3 points of each other. So it's going to get very, very interesting, guys. I hope you're excited for the predictions championship just as much as I am. It is heating up, and I'll be happy to take my first crown if it really shakes out that way. But guys, that wraps up our predictions. And the only question we have left is what is next in Formula One? We have 2 weeks to wait before F1 heads to Brazil to race around Interlagos. Last season, we saw a crazy podium of a Verstappen win, an Ocon and Gasly double Alpine podium, which was, looking at it now and seeing where Alpine is now versus last season, absolutely incredible. Who are we going to see on the podium this year? I think that is going to be a fascinating question to ask and a question I cannot wait to see answered. But guys, I hope you enjoyed the Mexico City Grand Prix. If you made it this far into the video, I really appreciate you. Subscribe if you haven't already and join our little community, as well as leave a comment down below giving your rating for the Mexico City Grand Prix out of 10. I think for me, I'm giving it a solid 9 out of 10. It was a very, 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 very good weekend, but I think that VSC at the end kind of kept it from ticking over to a 9.5 or even potentially a 10. Like the video if you haven't already, and guys, we'll be back in a few days for some more action. We'll probably get back to some more sim racing action from here, depending on when you're watching this. So hope you guys are excited for that. We'll be back in 2 weeks to talk about predictions for Brazil. But until then, guys, I'll see you in the next one.